All right, let's go. Number 10. The Valines. In the summer of 1864, Captain Charles Wilson of the Royal Engineers arrived in Jerusalem carrying survey instruments on behalf of the Palestine Exploration Fund, a newly formed organization dedicated to the scientific mapping of the biblical landscape. Wilson's team worked with systematic precision, measuring distances, recording elevations, documenting every named geographic feature in and around the city. South and southwest of the old city walls, the ground dropped away into a broad, shallow basin that opened toward Bethlehem. Wilson recorded its name in his field reports, exactly as the local population gave it to him. Emek Rephaim, the Valley of the Rephaim. He noted it without elaboration. It was already in 4 books of the canonical Bible. His job was to confirm it was where it had always been. It was. The valley appears in Joshua 15-8, where it marks a boundary of the tribal allotment of Judah. The text uses it as a navigational reference, a named geographic marker the reader could stand in. Joshua 18:16 uses it again for the allotment of Benjamin. In 2017 and 522, the Philistines twice deploy in the Valley of Rephaim when they march against David at Jerusalem. The text uses the location the way a military historian uses terrain, a named site with practical strategic properties known to both sides. In Isaiah 17-5, an 8th century prophet uses it as an agricultural metaphor, invoking it the way a speaker invokes a landscape everyone already knows. The name has survived. The German colony neighborhood of modern Jerusalem is centered on Emek Rephaim Street. The name is on municipal signage. It is on Google Maps. It is in the postal addresses of people who live there today. The word itself, Rephaim, plural of Rapha, Rish, Peh, Aleph, Yad, Mem, a people, not a topographic feature, not a deity, not a climate event. A people. The valley was named for a population who occupied the land before the accounts begin, and who the text consistently describes across multiple books as large, ancient, and formidably powerful. The Palestine Exploration Fund's survey mapped every ridge, valley, and wadi in the Jerusalem basin with engineering precision. Wilson's team, and subsequent surveys including the Ordnance Survey of Palestine, conducted through the 1870s, produced topographic documentation of a landscape that has not changed in its essential geography since the Bronze Age. And in all that documentation, the valley retained its name. The canonical text uses it 6 times, across 4 books, treating it as a feature any reader could locate. 3,000 years after those texts were written, it is still on the map. The people who stripped pre-Israelite geographic names from the landscape, who renamed cities and reattributed valleys across successive conquests, apparently could not dislodge this one. The Valley of the Rephaim kept its name through every empire that crossed it. Number 9. The Walls They Saw. In April 1955, Yigal Yadin of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem directed the first major systematic excavation of Tel El-Qida, a towering mound in the Upper Galilee overlooking the Hule Valley. The site had long been identified with ancient Hazor. Joshua 11:10 calls it the head of all those kingdoms. But the scope of what Yadin's team encountered exceeded prior estimates. The Tel rose above a secondary formation, a flattened lower plateau that proved on excavation to have been a Bronze Age urban complex. The lower city alone covered approximately 170 acres. The upper Tel added another 30. When combined, Hazor was the largest Bronze Age city in Canaan, by a margin that placed it in a different category from every other urban center in the region. Numbers 13 records the report of 12 spies sent into Canaan. They returned after 40 days. Verse 28 describes cities fortified and very large. Verse 33 describes the sons of Anak present in the territory, and a sense of scale so overwhelming that the spies reported feeling like grasshoppers in the sight of the people they encountered. The Canaanite fortification system of the Middle Bronze Age is one of the most systematically documented military architectures in the ancient Near East. The glacis, a sloped, engineered earth and stone ramp projecting outward from the base of a city wall. At Hazor, at Megiddo, at Gezer, at Lachish, at Tel Dan, the glacis systems excavated at these sites are not modest earthworks. They are measured in tens of meters of width. They slope at angles designed to make footing treacherous under fire. Below the glacis ran a fosse, a moat cut into bedrock. Above it, mud brick walls rose to heights the excavated sections and collapsed debris allow scholars to estimate it 8 to 10 meters, with towers projecting at intervals to allow defenders to fire along the face of the wall and eliminate attackers attempting to climb the slope. Yadin excavated Hazor over 4 seasons, concluding in 1958 and resuming in 1968. His successor, Amnon Ben-Tor of the Hebrew University, has continued excavations at the site since 1990. The Bronze Age urban complex they documented required not just organized labor, but sustained administrative investment across multiple generations. Megiddo, excavated by the Oriental Institute of Chicago beginning in 1925, produced a comparable picture. The Megiddo Bronze Age gate is among the largest yet documented in the ancient Near East. The city's strategic position controlling the Jezreel Valley Pass gave it a military significance the scale of its construction reflects precisely. A population accustomed to 40 years of desert encampment, portable shelters, no monumental construction, no urban architecture, encountering a city like Hazor for the first time would have found it unlike anything within their frame of reference. A mud brick wall 10 meters high, preceded by a raked glacis slope 30 to 40 meters wide, with towers projecting to command every approach. The visual experience of such a fortification from ground level, outside the fosse, looking up at the tower line, is not easily transmitted in language. The spies used the vocabulary available to them. But here's where the physical record adds something the text does not quite say explicitly. The scale of Canaanite Bronze Age fortifications was not decorative. The glacis, the fossa, the tower intervals, these are engineering parameters calibrated to specific threats. You do not build that kind of defense against threats that do not exist. The people inside Hazor's walls were building against something they had genuine reason to take seriously. The archaeological evidence of their construction is a document of what they feared, and the scale of their countermeasures reflects the scale of what was outside the walls. Yadin's excavation reports are published. Ben-Tor's ongoing work is published. The wall dimensions, the glacis measurements, the mud brick profiles, these are in the literature. The city the spies described as walled and enormous was in every archaeologically measurable sense, walled and enormous. What remains undisclosed is not the evidence. It is who, exactly, the inhabitants of Hazor's Bronze Age city considered a sufficient military threat to justify building the largest fortified urban complex in Canaan. Number 8. 24 digits. 2 Samuel 21. Does not describe one giant warrior from Gath. It describes 5. The most famous appears in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel. The remaining 4 are named in verses 15 through 22 of 2 Samuel 21, in what reads not as a legendary catalog, but as a military after-action record. Engagement by engagement, opponent by opponent, kill by kill. The phrase used for all 4 is Yulad la Rapha, born to the Rapha. In the original Hebrew, ha-Rapha, the Rapha, functions as a proper designation, the name of a specific lineage ancestor or clan progenitor. This is not a generic phrase meaning large person. It is a genealogical classification, the same kind of lineage marker that appears throughout the genealogical records of the Hebrew Bible to place an individual within a defined line of descent. The 4 warriors in 2 Samuel 21 are classified not by size alone, but by ancestry. They belong to a specific line. The 4 Ishbi Benob, whose spearhead weighed approximately 7.5 pounds of bronze, roughly the mass of a professional bowling ball, came close enough to killing David in combat that the text records Abishai of Zeruiah intervening to save the king's life. Saph, killed at Gob by Sibbecai, the Hushathite. A warrior identified as Lami, brother of Goliath the Gittite, killed by Elhanan. And a 4th man at Gath, whose physical characteristics the text records with a specificity that has no literary parallel in the ancient Near East for what it implies. 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. 24 digits in total. Postaxial polydactyly, the presence of an extra digit on the outer side of the hand or foot, is a documented human condition, autosomal dominant in inheritance. A single copy of the responsible gene variant is sufficient for expression. It is not rare enough to appear randomly in an invented description, and not universal enough to serve as a generic marker. When a text records not merely the presence of extra digits, but their specific number across 4 limbs, 24, it is recording an observed anatomical fact about a specific individual. No literary motivation exists for that level of precision. The detail serves no symbolic function in the narrative. It serves a forensic one. It identifies a person. Arn Meir of Bar Ilan University has directed excavations at Tel Es Safi, ancient Gath, confirmed as the largest Iron Age site in the Shephelah, since 1996. Decades of controlled excavation have exposed a large, organized Philistine community with material evidence of a distinct warrior culture, weapons assemblages, fortification systems, and evidence of a military class operating at a professional level within a structured urban center. The 2019 study published in Nature, led by Mikkel Feldman of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, analyzed ancient DNA from Philistine individuals recovered from the cemetery at Ashkelon, and confirmed that early Philistines carried a substantial genetic component consistent with Aegean or European origin. Absent from the contemporary Canaanite population, a distinct immigrant warrior people, concentrated in the coastal cities of the southern Levant, arriving around 1200 BCE. This is the population from which 2 Samuel 21:4 named warriors came. Not a mythological category, a real genetically distinct, professionally organized warrior culture, now confirmed through ancient DNA analysis. Concentrated in the exact cities the biblical text assigns to the warrior lineage, the text calls the Rapha. The truly disturbing aspect is not that the text names 4 additional warriors in addition to Goliath. It is that it names them with the precision of a legal record, a genealogical designation. A weapon's weight, a specific polydactyl digit count. Mythological inventions are described impressionistically. Lineage records are precise. The 24 digits are in the text. The hereditary warrior population they came from has now been confirmed genetically at Ashkelon. The city is in the ground in the Shephelah. This was a real warrior class, from a real city, classified by a real lineage designation used across 2 Samuel 21 with legal register specificity. And the names, Ishbi-Benob, Saph, the unnamed man with 24 digits, are still in the canonical text, 4 times in 8 verses, in a record the tradition preserved without explanation. Number 7. The Landscape of the Dead. In 1889, the Survey of Eastern Palestine, conducted for the Palestine Exploration Fund by Captain Claude Rainier Conder and Lieutenant Horatio Herbert Kitchener of the Royal Engineers, produced systematic documentation of the territory east of the Jordan River. The survey teams moved across the basalt plateau of the Harim and into the highlands of what is now northern Jordan, measuring distances, recording elevations, noting every topographic and architectural feature in the terrain. Among the features they documented repeatedly were large stone structures, broad, flat capstones resting on multiple upright stones, distributed across the plateau in clusters that sometimes numbered in the dozens. Conder noted in his published reports the name the local Arab population applied to them, the houses of the ancient ones. These are dolmens, megalithic burial structures built from the basalt of the plateau itself, distributed across the territory the biblical text identifies, by name, as the land of the Rephaim. Genesis 14-5 locates Rephaim at Ashtaroth Karnaim, a site in the Bashan region, the plateau territory that encompasses the modern Golan Heights and extends east into the Hauran. Deuteronomy 3:13 is explicit in its geographic designation. All that region of Bashan is called the land of Rephaim, not part of Bashan, all of it. The territorial designation covers the basalt plateau from the Yarmouk River north toward Mount Hermon and east from the Jordan into the Hauran, and that entire plateau is covered in dolmens. The construction of even a modest dolmen requires moving stone blocks of 1 to 3 tons, lifting, transporting, and positioning them with precision using human or animal force, rope, and lever. The larger examples in the Horan and the Jordanian highlands have capstones measuring several meters across and weighing substantially more. These are not accidental formations. They are engineered structures built with intention, requiring sustained communal organization to produce. Based on stratigraphic and ceramic evidence, they were built primarily in the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age periods, roughly 4,500 to 3,000 BCE, by a population that invested significant collective resources in the burial of its dead. Moshe Stekalis conducted systematic surveys of the megalithic structures in the southern Levant in the mid-20th century. Survey work continued through the 1980s, with Claire Epstein of the Israel Antiquities Authority documenting the Golan Heights portion of the distribution in detail. Survey work in the Jordanian highlands has added thousands more structures to the documented record. The total extent of the dolmen field across the Golan, the Hauran, and the northern Jordanian highlands has still not been fully cataloged. But here's where the scale becomes genuinely difficult to process. The dolmen fields east of the Jordan are not a handful of remarkable individual structures scattered across the landscape, They are a population's accumulated burial record. Distributed across the territory, the biblical text specifically and explicitly names as the land of Rephaim, in a density and concentration that implies the population who built them was numerous, organized, and present in the territory over an extended period. One legendary figure leaves a legend. A people leaves a landscape. What is in the territory of biblical Bashan and extending east into the Haran is a landscape. Those who built these structures left no surviving inscription to identify themselves. They left no written tradition, no named king, no administrative archive. They left stone, moved, and positioned at a scale that required the organized effort of a population substantial enough to sustain that kind of collective labor across generations. The territory they mark is the territory the text names. The density of their structures is the density of a culture's burial ground. Nobody who built at this scale, in this density, in this specific territory, and was then gone before the first surviving Israelite text was written, has ever been given any other name than the one Deuteronomy 3:13 still carries. Number 6. The Catalogue. In 1868, Frederick Augustus Klein, a French Alsatian missionary traveling in the territory east of the Dead Sea, was shown by a local guide a large, flat basalt stele near the ruins of ancient Deben. The stone was inscribed. Klein recognized its significance immediately. A royal inscription in the script and language of ancient Moab, recording the deeds of a king named Mesha. He reported the discovery to the scholarly world. A subsequent competition for possession of the stele resulted in local inhabitants fracturing it into pieces, most of which were recovered and reassembled. The inscription, now in the Louvre as AO 5066, known as the Mesha Stele, is an independent 9th century BCE Moabite royal text, confirming the Moabite kingdom in its exact biblical territory. Describing events the biblical text also records from the opposing side. The Mesha Stele matters to this entry, not for what it says about Moab, but for what its existence confirms about a passage that has no obvious reason to be in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 2, verses 10 through 23, is embedded in a travel narrative. Moses describing the Israelites' route through the Transjordan. And within the route description, without preamble, the text produces an ethnographic catalog of pre-Israelite populations that has no parallel in the ancient Near East for its geographic specificity. Verses 10 through 12. The territory of Moab was formerly occupied by the Emim, a people great, numerous, and tall as the Anakim, the text says. They too were counted as Rephaim, the text specifies, but the Moabites called them Emim, a distinct regional name, a specific territory, a classification, Rephaim by origin. Verses 20 through 21. The territory of Ammon was formerly occupied by the Zamzummim, a people great, numerous, and tall as the Anakim, displaced before the Ammonites settled the territory. Specific territory, specific local name, same classification, Rephaim. Verse 12 references the Horim, former inhabitants of Seir, the territory of Edom to the south, displaced by the descendants of Esau. Verse 23 references the Avvim, former inhabitants of the Gaza region, displaced by the Caphtorim arriving from Crete. The Catalogue. 5 distinct named populations, each with its regional designation, each localized to a specific territory, each described as having been large and powerful and ancient, and each connected to the broader Rephaim category. The text does not describe the Emim as supernatural or the Zamzummim as legendary. It describes them the way a chronicle describes displaced peoples. They were here before, they were substantial, they are now gone, and the people who replaced them still remember their names. The Mesha Stele confirms that Moab was a real kingdom with a real scribal tradition, occupying exactly the territory the Deuteronomy catalog assigns to the Emim. The Ammon Citadel inscription, an Ammonite text discovered in 1961 at the Ammon Citadel, confirms Ammon as a functioning Iron Age kingdom in exactly the territory the catalog assigns to the Zamzummim. Edom is confirmed through multiple independent sources. The successor kingdoms to every territory the Deuteronomy catalog describes have been independently confirmed through epigraphy and archaeology. The Bronze Age occupation of the Transjordanian Plateau has been documented through systematic survey archaeology conducted from the 1970s onward, confirming continuous settlement across the territories the catalog describes. Consider the implication. A 12-verse geographic aside embedded in a travel narrative preserves the names, territories, and population category, Rephaim, of 5 distinct pre-Israelite peoples, each with its local designation, each occupying a named and archaeologically confirmed territory. No other document from the ancient Near East produces a comparable ethnographic record of specifically named, territorially localized large population groups. This is not mythology organized by type. It is ethnography organized by region. 5 peoples, 5 territories, 5 local names, 1 overarching classification, and every successor kingdom the catalog names as their replacement has been independently confirmed. This level of geographic specificity does not arise from invention. It arises from living memory, from a tradition that recorded these names when the successor populations still knew them, because the populations they had replaced were recent enough to remember. The Emim are gone. The Zamzumim are gone. The Moabites who remembered calling them Emim eventually left their own inscription on a basalt stele, and that stele is in the Louvre. What they called the people who were there before them is still in Deuteronomy 2 verse 11, where it has been for 3,000 years. Number 5. Kiriath Arba. In the 1980s, Emanuel Eisenberg of the Israel Antiquities Authority directed excavations at Tel Rumeida, the mound in the southern part of the modern city of Hebron, identified as ancient Kiriath Arba, the original Hebron. The site occupies a hilltop in the Judean highlands at approximately 930 meters above sea level, among the highest Bronze Age urban settlements in the region. Eisenberg's team exposed occupation layers, reaching back into the Middle Bronze Age beneath multiple later strata. What they documented was a fortified Bronze Age settlement built from substantial limestone masonry on a command position hilltop, with construction characteristics, the size of the blocks, the thickness of the walls, that set it apart from contemporary lower elevation sites in the Shephelah. Joshua 14:15 records the city's original name and attaches to it a detail that serves no narrative function. Unless it is historical, Hebron was formerly called Kiriath Arba. Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim. The Hebrew is Ha-Adam Ha-Gadol, literally, the great man, among the specifically named warrior people. Kiriath is the Hebrew word for city of. Kiriath Arba, city of Arba. Cities in the ancient Near East were named for gods, for geographic features, for events, for founding kings. The compound Kiriath appears throughout Canaanite place names in exactly this pattern. Kiriath Jearim, city of the forests. Kiriath Sefer, city of writing. Kiriath Baal, city of Baal. Kiriath Arba follows the same naming convention, a city defined by its association with a specific person. The text that preserves this name identifies that person's position within the Anakim explicitly, and preserves the name as a founding tradition, exactly the way ancient Near Eastern cities preserve their founders' names. The same identification appears in Joshua 21:11, in 1 Chronicles 6:55, in Genesis 23:2, where Abraham buys a burial field near Kiriath Arba after the death of Sarah. 4 separate canonical texts across multiple literary genres: legal narrative, genealogical record, tribal boundary, property transaction, preserve the same pre-Israelite name for the same city, with the same identification of its founder as the greatest of the Anakim. Numbers 13:22 places 3 named individuals, Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, sons of Anak, specifically at Hebron during the reconnaissance mission. These are not generic giants occupying a generic city. They are named individuals, classified as sons of a named ancestor, residing in a specific city that the text has already established bears the name of the greatest man of their people. The geographic pattern across the Anakim accounts is consistent and notable. Joshua 11:21 records the campaign to dislodge them. Joshua cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Israel. Not the coastal plain, not the Jordan Valley. The hill country, the elevated terrain of the Judean highlands, between 700 and 1,000 meters above sea level. The Anakim strongholds were consistently highland positions. The excavations at Tel Rumeida show exactly this: a fortified settlement at elevation, commanding the surrounding high country, built with the kind of substantial masonry appropriate to a strategic position in the highlands. Numbers 13:22 also preserves a datable detail. Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. Zoan, identified with Tanis in the eastern Nile Delta, has been placed by Egyptologists in the early 2nd millennium BCE. If Hebron predates Zoan by 7 years, its foundation falls in the early to mid-2nd millennium, directly consistent with the Middle Bronze Age occupation layers Eisenberg documented at Tel Rumeida. The truly unsettling aspect of this entry is not the fortifications, it is the naming convention. Cities in the ancient world were named for real founders, kings who actually built them, ancestors who actually established them. The preservation of the name Kiriath Arba across 4 canonical texts, from 4 separate literary contexts, with the consistent identification of Arba as the greatest man among the Anakim, follows the same pattern that preserved the names of real founders of real cities across the entire ancient Near Eastern record. No tradition names a city for a figure it regards as legendary. The naming convention is forensic. What the Bronze Age layers at Tel Rumeda contain is the material foundation of a city the text calls by the name of a specific man. The greatest man, the text says, among a warrior people treated across multiple books and genres as historical. The stratigraphy reaches the period the text describes. The fortification walls Eisenberg documented are built from the same limestone the Judean highlands have always provided. 4 canonical texts, 4 literary contexts, 1 name. The hill has not moved. The name has not changed. The layers that predate every Israelite account of the city are still in the ground at Tel Rumeda, waiting below every century that came after. Number 4. The bed and the basalt. In the mid-1980s, Claire Epstein of the Israel Antiquities Authority moved systematically across the basalt plateau of the Golan Heights, documenting the megalithic structures distributed across the volcanic landscape. The Golan, the territory the biblical text calls Bashan, is built from dark volcanic stone, geologically distinct from the limestone and chalk of the Judean hills. Epstein moved between clusters of dolmens, measuring capstones, photographing chambers, recording the distribution of structures across a landscape that had clearly served for someone as a primary burial ground across multiple generations. The scale of what she was documenting, structures distributed across the plateau in their thousands, was not consistent with the burial record of a small population. It required a numerically significant community that had occupied this territory for a sustained period. Deuteronomy 3:11 is inserted into the account of the Israelite campaign in the Transjordan, as what reads, unmistakably, as a citation footnote appended to a claim the author knew would require verification. The narrative moves. Then it pauses, inserts a measurement, and names a location where the evidence can be checked. For only Og, king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. His bed was of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to a man's cubit. 9 cubits by 4 cubits. At the standard Israelite cubit of approximately 18 inches, this is roughly 13.5 feet long and 6 feet wide. The text does not merely assert this measurement. It names the object's current location, Rabbah of the Ammonites, the city that is modern Amman, Jordan, and the syntax invites the reader, in the construction of a citation, to go there and verify the claim. The Hebrew is Eres Barzel, Eres, a couch, a sleeping platform, or in mortuary contexts, a bier or funerary surface. Barzel, the standard Hebrew word for iron, but its use here has attracted sustained scholarly attention. Basalt sarcophagi, large, dark volcanic stone burial vessels, were prestigious funerary objects in the Bronze Age Bashan region, and were traded and displayed across the Levant. The material the Bashan Plateau is made of is basalt. The burial structures covering the plateau are made of basalt. Some scholars reading Deuteronomy 3:11 have proposed that Eres Barzel describes not an iron sleeping bed, but a basalt funerary sarcophagus, a large, dark stone burial object transported to Rabbah as a trophy after the Israelite defeat of Og, kept there for public display. Under that reading, the text is describing a basalt sarcophagus in the city of the Ammonites, available for inspection, with its dimensions recorded to the cubit. The Golan Basalt Plateau, Og's territory, which Deuteronomy 3 defines by a specific list of cities, including Ashtaroth and Edrei and 60 cities of the Argob region, is covered in the burial structures of the people who occupied it before the Israelite entry into Canaan. Claire Epstein's surveys documented the distribution and scale of the Golan dolmen field. The structures predate the period of the Israelite campaigns by roughly a millennium, placing their construction in the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age. The predecessors of the population the biblical tradition names as the Rephaim. But here's where the text's editorial choice becomes the most disturbing element of this entry. The author of Deuteronomy 3:11 did not simply claim that Og was enormous. The author provided the measurement. And then the author provided the verification, the object's location. in a named city in the territory of a named people. This is a citation structure. It presupposes a reader who can, in principle, travel to Rabbah and check. A text that fabricates a legendary giant king does not then append public directions to the giant's funerary furniture. That is not how legendary traditions operate. That is how historical records operate. The Golan dolmen field covers the basalt plateau the text calls Bashan. Claire Epstein spent years documenting it. The capstones she measured are still on the plateau. The text gives the dimensions of Og's burial structure to the cubit and names where it was kept. The landscape his predecessors left behind is made of the same material the text says the structure was made from. The measurement is in Deuteronomy. The territory is in the Golan. The basalt is on the ground. The structures that predate every Israelite text are still in the territory the text names by a specific king's name, as the homeland of the last of the Rephaim. Number 3. The population they came from. In 2013, during what would prove to be the final excavation season before development constraints changed access to the site, the Leon Levy expedition to Ashkelon, at that time directed by Daniel Master of Wheaton College, following the long directorship of Lawrence Steger of Harvard University, made a discovery that had eluded over a century of Philistine archaeology. North of the ancient city, beneath a layer of sand that had preserved the remains in extraordinary condition, the team uncovered a cemetery. Over 150 individuals buried according to practices unlike anything documented at Canaanite or Israelite sites of the same period, evidence of Philistine ritual applied to Philistine dead. This was the first Philistine cemetery ever found. The remains entered laboratory analysis. In July 2019, the journal Nature published a study led by Mikkel Feldman of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, with co-authors from the Hebrew University Harvard and multiple European institutions. The team had analyzed ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains of Philistine individuals buried at Ashkelon. Across multiple periods, the results settled a debate that had persisted in Philistine scholarship for decades. Early Philistine individuals, those from the first generations of settlement in the southern Levant, roughly the 12th and 11th centuries BCE, carried a substantial genetic component absent from the contemporary Canaanite population. The component was consistent with origin in the Aegean or southern Europe. The Philistines who arrived in Canaan around 1200 BCE were not Canaanites who had adopted a different material culture. They were genetically distinct. They came from the West. Within a few generations, through intermarriage with the surrounding population, the European genetic component diminished and blended into the regional genetic background. But in the earliest burials, the distinction is clear and measurable. The biblical text describes the Philistines as coming from Caphtor. Amos 9-7 uses the same designation. Jeremiah 47-4 connects them to the coastlands of Caphtor, but consensus identification of Caphtor with Crete or the broader Aegean had been the scholarly position for generations. The 2019 paper published confirmation from ancient DNA, Aegean origin, arriving at precisely the period the texts describe. Now consider what the canonical text also preserves about this same population's relationship to the giant warrior tradition. Joshua 11:21 through 22 records Joshua's campaign against the Anakim in the Judean hill country. The text is explicit about the result. Joshua eliminated the Anakim from the highlands. And then verse 22 specifies exactly where the survivors went. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the Israelites. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. 3 Philistine cities. The Anakim, the highland warrior population the text describes as having dominated the Judean high country, survived specifically in the cities of the genetically distinct European origin immigrant population that the 2019 paper has now confirmed. A century and a half after Joshua's campaigns, 2 Samuel 21 produces 5 warriors from Gath. One of the 3 cities Joshua names as Anakim refuges, each classified as born to Ha-Rapha, each using the Rephaim lineage designation. The genetics paper was not studying this question. Feldman's team was studying Philistine population origins. The finding that early Philistines in the 12th and 11th centuries BCE were genetically distinct European origin immigrants concentrated in the coastal cities of the southern Levant was produced without reference to the Anakim narrative, and the alignment with the canonical framework is precise. A genetically distinct European origin warrior population arriving around 1200 BCE, concentrated in the cities the canonical text names as the places the Anakim survived after the Highland campaigns. What makes this convergence particularly difficult to account for is its layering. Joshua 11:22 is in the canonical text. The Feldman genetic study is in Nature. The three cities named in Joshua, Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, are confirmed by the genetics paper as home to a distinct immigrant warrior population, arriving at exactly the period the Joshua narrative describes. The alignment between a canonical verse naming the Anakim's three refuge cities and a 2019 genetics paper confirming those exact cities hosted a distinct warrior population from the Aegean at the right time was not a hypothesis the researchers were testing. It emerged from the data. The skeletal remains from the Ashkelon cemetery are in laboratory storage. The DNA data is published in Nature. Joshua 11:22 is in the canonical text. And in one of those three cities, Gath, a century and a half later, 5 warriors are named in the canonical record, classified by a lineage designation that connects them to the very population the text said survived there. That is 3 independent data streams: a canonical verse specifying where the Anakim took refuge, a genetic study confirming a distinct immigrant warrior population in those exact cities, and a second canonical passage naming warriors from one of those cities by a Rephaim lineage term, arriving at the same point from entirely different directions. The genetics paper arrived at it through an ancient DNA laboratory in Leipzig. The canonical text arrived at it through a scribal tradition thousands of years older. Neither source was looking for the other. The convergence is in the record. Number 2. The other tradition. In late April of 1929, a Syrian farmer plowing a field at Ras Shamra on the northwestern coast of Syria, near modern Latakia, struck his plow against a stone-capped tomb. The find was reported to the French Mandate authorities. Claude F.A. Schaeffer, an archaeologist with the Musées Nationaux de France, arrived to assess the disturbed ground and recognized, in the stratified deposits and architectural traces visible at the surface, the signs of a major Bronze Age settlement beneath. He began excavating that same year, 1929, and would continue the work for decades. What was beneath Ras Shamra was ancient Ugarit, a Bronze Age city-state that had maintained diplomatic correspondence with Egypt and the Hittites, administered a sophisticated commercial economy, and produced a literary and religious tradition in its own alphabetic cuneiform script. A script deciphered in 1930 through the collaborative work of Hans Bauer, Édouard Dorme, and Charles Veroliad, working at first independently and then together on the initial tablets. Ugarit was destroyed around 1185 BCE, most likely during the broader catastrophe that ended the Late Bronze Age across the eastern Mediterranean. The fires baked the clay tablets in the palace archives and scribal libraries, sealing them in the rubble until Schaeffer's excavation recovered them. Among the thousands of tablets cataloged in the standard scholarly edition, Keil Alphabetisch Texte aus Ugarit, known by its abbreviation KTU, were 3 designated KTU 1.20, 1.22. Scholars subsequently named them the Rephaim texts. The tablets are fragmentary. What survives describes a ritual gathering. An invitation is extended to a group identified as the RPM. They travel on horses and in chariots. They arrive. They feast. The category of beings the texts describe, the RPUM, has been the subject of sustained scholarly analysis for decades. Theodore Lewis of Johns Hopkins University, whose 1989 study Cults of the Dead in Ancient Israel and Ugarit remains a standard reference on the subject, identified the RPUM as a category functioning in the Ugaritic literary world as both a living military aristocracy and the deified spirits of heroic dead, a warrior elite whose status bridges the boundary between the living and the dead, simultaneously the champions of the present generation and the honored ancestors of the lineage. KTU 1.108, a separate Ugaritic text, uses the phrase RPUM of the earth, a designation that appears to distinguish the living members of this warrior class from their dead counterparts. Here is the word. In Ugaritic, RPUM, the consonants RP. In Biblical Hebrew, Rephaim, the consonants Resh, Peh, Aleph, in plural form. The root is identical. The grammatical construction is identical. The plural form is identical. And the Biblical Hebrew word Rephaim carries the same dual valence in the canonical text that RPM carries in the Ugaritic tablets. In the books of Joshua, Deuteronomy, and 2 Samuel, Rephaim designates a living warrior people. The Anakim, the Emen, the Zamzumim, the warriors of Gath. In Isaiah 14-9, Isaiah 26, 14, Psalms 88, 10, Proverbs 2:18 and 21:16, and Job 26-5, the same word designates the shades of the dead, the spirits of the departed, present in Sheol, living warriors, and heroic dead. Both uses appear in the canonical text. Both uses appear in the Ugaritic tablets, the same word in two unrelated scribal traditions, carrying the same double meaning. Ugarit was a Canaanite city-state. Its scribal tradition was not an Israelite tradition. Its religious texts were produced by a scribal class at a Syrian coastal city, with no direct cultural continuity with the biblical tradition developing in the Judean highlands and the Transjordan. The tablets were sealed in 1185 BCE, before the composition of the majority of the biblical texts in which Rephaim appears. But here's where the convergence becomes genuinely impossible to dismiss. If the Rephaim were an Israelite mythological construction, a people invented to explain the memory of large Bronze Age fortifications and powerful pre-Israelite populations, then the scribal tradition of Ugarit independently invented the same mythological category, using the same name with the same dual register of living warriors and heroic dead during the same historical period, without any available mechanism for borrowing in either direction. The alternative is that RPUM in Ugaritic and Rephaim in Biblical Hebrew both refer to the same thing, because both traditions were describing the same historical reality. A warrior elite, known by this name across the Canaanite world, real enough to generate two entirely separate literary traditions in two different scripts on opposite ends of the Canaanite world, preserving the same name and the same dual character. KTU 1.20, 1.21, and 1.22 are Canaanite tablets. They were not written by Israelites for an Israelite audience to preserve an Israelite tradition. They were sealed in 1185 BCE and recovered from Ras Shamra. They name, in their own language and their own script, a warrior people. The biblical tradition also names, with the same consonants, the same plural form, the same double meaning. The scope of what that convergence requires is worth stating plainly. Two scribal traditions, separated by geography, by script, by language, by religious framework, and by the entire width of the Canaanite world, both independently preserved, across centuries, a category of warrior people with the same name and the same dual character of living elite and heroic dead. For that convergence to be coincidental, the coincidence must extend not just to the name but to the concept, not just to the word but to the meaning the word carried in both traditions simultaneously. The Ugaritic scribes who composed KTU 1.20 were not borrowing from a Hebrew tradition. The Hebrew scribes who recorded the Rephaim as both a living people in Deuteronomy and as shades of the dead in Isaiah were not borrowing from Ugarit. Both traditions arrived at the same place. The biblical text did not invent the Rephaim. The evidence from Ras Shamra makes that position impossible to sustain. Number 1. The Sherd and the Cubit. In the summer of 2005, a student volunteer working on Aaron Meir's excavation at Tel Es Safi, the site in Israel's Shephelah foothills identified as ancient Gath, was moving material from an Iron Age stratum when a pottery fragment came up in the bucket. It was the kind of sherd that comes up by the hundreds at an active excavation site, a fragment of a large storage vessel, the type produced in quantity at Philistine urban centers of the period. What differentiated it was visible before the sherd had been fully cleaned, characters scratched into the ceramic surface before firing, in a script unlike anything previously recovered from the site. The sherd went to the epigrapher, Aaron Meir, together with epigraphers Stefan Wimmer, Alexander Zuckerman, and Aaron Dembski, published the inscription in the Bulletin of the American Schools of Oriental Research, Volume 351, in 2008. The script was identified as Old Canaanite Proto-Philistine, the earliest Philistine alphabetic inscription ever recovered. Scratched into the surface were two names, ALWT and WLT. The publication's analysis concluded that both names share the same phonological root as the Hebrew name Goliath, GLJT in the consonantal Hebrew. The names on the sherd are not identical to the Hebrew form. They are Philistine names in a Philistine script from a Philistine city that share the same etymological and phonological root as the warrior the Hebrew tradition names Goliath. The inscription demonstrates that names built on this pattern were in active use in the Philistine cultural sphere at Gath during the Iron Age I and early Iron Age IIA period. This is the period in which the biblical narrative places the confrontation between David and Goliath. Tel Es Safi's identification as ancient Gath rests on multiple independent lines of evidence: its geographic position in the Shephelah, its ceramic assemblage, its stratigraphic profile, and its scale, the largest Iron Age site in the Shephelah by a significant margin. Mayer's excavations, ongoing since 1996, have produced a picture of a large, militarily organized Philistine urban center, consistently documenting material evidence of a significant Iron Age Philistine community. The potsherd puts a name phonetically equivalent to Goliath at the right city, at the right time. The name was real, the city was real, the period was right. Now the text, 1 Samuel 17-4, in the Masoretic tradition, the standardized Hebrew text compiled by Jewish scholars between approximately the 6th and 10th centuries of the Common Era, describes Goliath's height as 6 cubits and a span. 6 cubits and a span at the standard Israelite cubit of approximately 18 inches is roughly 9 feet, 9 inches. The Dead Sea Scrolls manuscript designated 4Q Sam A, recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran and dated by paleographic and material analysis to the late 1st century BCE, approximately a millennium before the Masoretic standardization, gives Goliath's height as 4 cubits and a span. 4 cubits and a span is approximately 6 feet 9 inches. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures produced from Hebrew manuscripts beginning in the 3rd century BCE, gives the same figure, 4 cubits and a span. Josephus, writing his Antiquities of the Jews in the 1st century CE, gives the same figure, 4 cubits and a span. 4 independent witnesses, 4Q Sam. A, the Septuagint, Josephus, and the broader pre-Masoretic manuscript tradition all give the lower figure. The Masoretic text, standardized between the 6th and 10th centuries CE, gives a figure 2 full cubits higher. Emmanuel Tav of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, general editor of the Dead Sea Scrolls Publication Project, and one of the foremost authorities on textual variants in the Hebrew Bible, has addressed the Samuel manuscripts in published work, noting that the shorter figure is attested in the earliest available witnesses to the text. What the earlier reading describes is a man of approximately 6 feet 9 inches. In the Iron Age, when average male height in the Levant was approximately 5 feet 5 to 5 feet 7 inches, a man of 6 feet 9 was a physical outlier of the kind immediately visible in any assembly of warriors. Taller than any opponent in the field, capable of projecting exactly the psychological effect the narrative describes. He was not supernatural. He was at the extreme upper boundary of documented human variation for the period. What the textual substitution reveals is a gap of 2 cubits introduced somewhere between 4Q Sam A and the Masoretic standardization. The difference between 4 and 6 in the relevant Hebrew numeral system is not a copying error of the kind that produces accidental variance, a misread letter, a skipped line. It is a deliberate alteration. Someone, at some point in the transmission history of 1 Samuel, changed Goliath's height from the scale of an extraordinary human being to a scale the human body cannot reach. Now place these 2 pieces of evidence alongside each other. The potsherd at Tel Es Safi establishes that a Goliath pattern name was used in the Philistine warrior community at Gath during the Iron Age I period. The right name, the right city, the right time. The 4Q Sam, a manuscript, establishes that the original textual description of that warrior's height placed him at 6 feet 9 inches. Extraordinary, physically dominating, genuinely formidable, and within the documented range of human height. The Masoretic text establishes that the tradition which came after added 2 cubits to that description, converting a very large man into a figure of mythological proportion. The potsherd confirms the name was real. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirm the man was described, in the earliest available witnesses, at a scale a real human body can reach. What the Masoretic tradition changed, and why, is documented in the manuscript record and has been published in the academic literature on textual variants in Samuel. The mechanism of the change is clear. The motivation is not. Consider what the earlier reading would have meant to the tradition that preserved it. A man of 6 feet 9 inches, in a period when the average warrior stood at 5.5 feet, was not a creature of myth. He was a real military problem, a professional fighter with a reach advantage, a psychological advantage, and a physical presence that could be described accurately and terrifyingly without any supernatural enhancement. The 4 cubits figure describes a man whose intimidation was grounded entirely in the physical. The 6 cubits figure requires an explanation the biology of the period cannot provide. Someone decided, somewhere in the transmission history, that the real man was not large enough, that the historical record needed to be adjusted upward to match the tradition's sense of what the confrontation meant. The 4Q Sam, a manuscript, is in the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. The Besoar 351 publication describing the Tel Es Safi Sherd is in the public record. Both are accessible. Both are published. One names a Goliath pattern warrior at the right city at the right time. The other describes that warrior in the earliest available manuscript tradition, at a height within the range of the extraordinary human, and documents that the tradition which came after made him 3 feet taller. A man named Goliath, from Gath, of extraordinary but humanly possible stature. That is what the earliest available physical evidence and the earliest available manuscript witnesses together describe. What the later tradition added to that man is recorded in the gap between 4Q Sam, A, and the Masoretic text. That gap has been measured. It is 2 cubits. It is still there in the manuscript record, and it does not have an explanation that the evidence provides. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.